Hello. Today we are going to talk about images and the importance of images as a foundational component of creative writing, specifically poetry. So where does poetry come from? It comes from our imagination, right? And in order to come up with the poetry we write, we have to imagine it. Right? Before we put it down on the paper or we type it out, we're imagining things. We're imagining ideas, memories, scenery, all of that kind of stuff. And we're putting that image down on the page, right? So just thinking about the word imagination and how imagine, the verb, is in there, and then the noun image is that final result, right? So poetry, all creative writing, but specifically poetry, it's about creating a mental image. It's about creating a mental picture. Like a photographer, we want to add our own flavor, but we also want to be objective when we're capturing that image so that our readers can come to their own conclusions and inject their own experiences into it, right? When we read, no matter what we're reading, our mind is processing those words and turning those words into mental images, right? And the way that our mind does so is by translating it through our sensory experiences, right? Through our five senses: see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. So after the image is sort of exported, then we can, as the reader, we can look at it and process it again back into an abstract idea, right? So those images that are based on those sensory experiences, they get processed back into thoughts and feelings that we can make connections between when we're reading a poem. So we've got all these different images in a poem, and our mind has sort of made sense of them through how it makes us feel, through the experiences we've had with those particular images. And then we sort of bring logic and thinking back into it. And that's where these ideas about the connection between those images comes into play. This is where we start talking about metaphors and symbolism. All those intellectual concepts that we learn about writing and about close reading of creative work and creative art, that's back into play. All right, so we should always be asking the question, what types of connections, like contrast, what's resonating, what suggestions do the images make between each other, stand alone, both as the reader when we're reading and also as the poet when we're writing. We want to have that forethought and intention of why we are creating an image for someone to experience. So we get these images through descriptions, right? And so we want to think about, how do the descriptions interact with the physical, emotional, and mental, or like intellectual experiences? They all interact differently depending on what level we're working on, right? So look at these two examples here. The first sentence, the first line: the child was sad because it was her first day of school, right? I don't know about you, but for me, physically and emotionally, I'm not really getting much. Intellectually, I understand the child was sad, right? That's the crux of it, and the reason, because she's going to school, or on her first day of school. Depending on our experiences, that might be a joy for one child and very sad for another. So it's a lot of different experiences that are coming into play. Now look at this second description: standing in the doorway between her classroom and the sunny sidewalk, 4-year-old Meredith twisted her mother's flowered skirt in her hands, hid her face in its folds, and stained its red silk with the thick mucus of her nose. Whoa. There's a lot of physical elements going on. There's sensory things happening, right? We're getting a sense of space. We're getting a sense of texture, tactile, feel, right? We're getting maybe the warmth, or looking at the sun from the doorway, we see the warmth, but then we see that we're entering into a space that might not be so warm. Very specific language, twisting the flowered skirt in her hands, right? The colors of the silk, the thick mucus. They could have just said boogers, but maybe that would take away from the tone, right? So look at the difference in those two descriptions and how much interaction is going on with your physical, emotional, and mental interpretation of that second line as opposed to that first line. So for the reader, how do we experience poetry? How do we make sense of it? Again, through the sensations, right? It's sensory. Then we make sense of those sensations based on bringing it back to the intellectual. For us as the poet, how do we work through and gain new understanding of our poems? So we envision what we want the poem to be. Then we put it down on the page. And then from there, we have to revision or re-envision it after we've sat back with it, after we've gotten some peer responses from it. And then we create a new vision for it, for others to sense. So we really want to think about poetry and the image and the purpose of poetry. The Greek term poiesis means making, right? So we're making images, we're making meaning. And throughout time, poetry has had different purposes for different cultures, right? So it might be an oral tradition meant for record keeping. It might be for the leisure, pleasure, entertainment of how it sounds and how it makes us feel. It could be a part of ritual, part of a religious practice. We might think of it as a tool for self-expression and for meaning making. Edward Hirsch calls poetry or poems an event in language, right? An event or an occurrence that happens through language, created into an image. And so I'm sure you've heard this show, don't tell, right? You've heard this when you're writing stories. This is ever so true for writing poetry. When we think of abstract words and concrete words, right? Abstract words, that's telling. That's making us think. With poetry, we want to go more into the idea of using concrete words. That's the showing, because it's causing us to feel. It's causing us to have a sensory experience. So this is a quote pulled right from the textbook. The adage, show don't tell, is shorthand for the most important tenet of creative writing. You're asked to create with attention to the concrete physical world, rather than telling with abstract words, because those produce thoughts about the speaker's experience or ideas instead of the feelings that can happen within the reader, through the reader's body, through their five senses, right? So being intentional. Think about which senses are engaged in you when you read a poem, from poem to poem. As a reader, also think about your intention. What senses do you want to engage when you're writing a particular poem? Are you trying to evoke an idea of smell, of sight, of touch? Is it all? It doesn't have to be just one. Sometimes there's a main focus of which sense you want to engage with. But just having that intention, even line to line. And so how do we get to make these images? We think about the structure of a line. Your idea of adjectives and adverbs. Remember, an adjective modifies a noun, adverbs modify verbs, right? So it might be counterintuitive. We might think, oh, if we put some of these ly words in here and we describe the noun, then we're doing our job and we're being creative and we're giving detail. That's not really the case with poetry. We want to get specific, but concrete. So just looking at these descriptions down here, do this, pause the video and choose one of these lines and look at the adjectives and adverbs in that line and maybe the verbs and see how you can revise it to make it more descriptive. A little more about abstract words and concrete words. Abstractions, again, they tell us as a reader how the speaker feels and thinks about what's being written about. But concrete words puts us as the reader or our readership into the experience so that they can feel it through the senses. Think about the concept of love. That's an abstract word. We can feel love But how do we feel it when we explain it? It's typically physical. Oh, I get butterflies in my stomach. I get chills. My face gets hot. It's sensory, right? So those abstract words, we get a general idea when we hear them and we read them. But to get more concrete words with specific detail, that allows us to step outside of ourselves as the readers and try and feel where the poet was going, right? So an idea here, think about the abstract word relaxing. That means different things to different people. But if we put a concrete word here, like a boat, and we can get more specific, a sailboat, a yacht, you know, those images can start to become symbolic for the idea of relaxing, right? In other ways, it could be something way more dangerous, like being out at sea on like a Navy ship or something like that. So you see how images can change the more specific they get. So going back to when we're doing our readings, upon our first reading, the scene is being created for us through the images, right? Then when we start reading through it more, we're looking for the details in the diction to make connections between the images. And that's what creates those figures of speeches, the metaphor, the symbolism. That's what allows us to feel and then move into thinking about what was felt, right? So remember, as the poet, write what you see, what you envision, not what you think and feel about that, right? As readers, we like to come to our own conclusions. So if you want some practice examples from the text, there 54 to 55 has some ideas about making images more concrete and removing your filters. Same thing with verbs. Remember, a verb is a word used to describe an action or a state or an occurrence, right? In poetry, verbs define the subject. They affect the tension, the tone, the energy of the poem, the pace of it, line to line, and the whole poem as a whole, right? So thinking about those to be verbs like I am, she is, you were, all of those tend to make what's happening a little passive, adds too many syllables maybe, it just gets a little wordy. So you want to arm yourself with strong active verbs when you're revising. Consider your verb choice. One thing to note is that our English language is based a lot on words from Latin and from German, right? Those are like the primary spaces that we are pulling from in English. Latin words, we think of those as maybe SAT words. They tend to be more abstract, rooted in thought and philosophy, while the Anglo-Saxon or Germanic words, those tend to be more sensory, more concrete. So we wanna maybe opt for Anglo-Saxon words. It really depends what you're going for, but more often than not, we want to be more concrete in our poetry than abstract. So thinking about figures of speech, which is what is created by all the image connections. Remember, figurative language is not meant to be taken literally. Some ideas of figurative language: hyperbole, which is exaggeration; similes, using like or as for comparison; personification, giving human qualities to something non-human; metaphor is a direct comparison to two seemingly unlike things. And then these other two, they're nice to know, but I think those first four are probably the bigger ones that you'll be interested in using. Philosopher John Locke says, nothing in the intellect that was not previously in the senses. So what that means is language itself is really symbolic. It ends up tracing its roots back to something concrete and physical. Lastly, avoiding cliches. They're gonna end up in your writing. Just to avoid them or to revise, be direct, remove the figurative language, be more specific with your descriptive language, or make the metaphor your own. Flip it on its head. Here's a list of resources, and stay tuned for more.